Welcome back, deep divers. Today, we're going deep on something really foundational, I think, for healthy relationships. I mean, for work, for even just our relationship with ourselves.
Yeah.
Boundaries.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
We are diving deep into this book. Boundaries, when to say yes, how to say no to take control of your life.
hmm
And I am so excited to really kind of unpack this with you because
Yeah.
it's one of those things like we hear the word boundaries, we kind of get it, but this book really lays it out in a way that's, I think, going to be so helpful for all of us as we kind of
Yeah.
navigate life and relationships.
It gives us a lot more clarity about what it is, how to do it well, how to do it poorly, and some of the things that might be holding us back from really setting good boundaries.
Yeah, totally. And
Yeah.
that's what I love about this deep dive is that we're really going to unpack like what are those things that might be holding us back. So just to kind of recap, like what is our mission for this deep dive? You know, if somebody's listening, what are they going to walk away with?
Okay, so think of it like this. By the end of this deep dive, you're going to have this solid understanding of what boundaries actually are, why they're super important in every area of life, and most importantly, how you can apply these principles to your own life.
Yes. Because it's one thing to read a book and be like, oh, that's cool, boundaries, but like how do we actually make that practical?
Right, exactly.
And I think that's where we want to go with this. Now, this book is full of all kinds of information. We're going to do our best to pull out those like golden nuggets.
Absolutely.
And I think one of the best things they do right at the beginning is they talk about boundaries being property lines for our souls.
Oh, I love that analogy.
Isn't that great?
Yeah.
So can we unpack that a little bit? Like, what does that even mean?
Yeah, so think of it this way. Your soul, like your innermost self, the core of who you are,
Yeah.
is like your most valuable possession, right? And just like you wouldn't let anyone just walk onto your property and start taking things or messing things up, boundaries protect your soul from intrusion, violations, from people who might want to take advantage of you.
Yes. And I think we all sadly have had the experience of maybe feeling taken advantage of, feeling like our time is not valued, our energy is not valued, and our kind of yes is not valued either. You know?
Exactly.
It's almost like people expect that from us.
Yeah.
So it's not about building walls to shut everyone out. It's really about defining what's your values, your time, your energy, all that, and taking ownership of it.
That's it. It's about recognizing that you have a right to protect what's precious to you. And saying no is not selfish. It's actually like the most self-respecting thing you can do sometimes.
Yes, preach. I love it. Okay, so one of the things I found so fascinating in this book is how they kind of dive into that biblical basis for boundaries. And I don't know if I had ever thought about it that way before, but they actually argue that God himself has boundaries.
Yeah.
Right. He is distinct, he's responsible for himself, and he communicates his limits, very clearly. There's this great analogy I thought that they'd use. So imagine God is your neighbor, right? And he never waters his lawn, but he totally benefits from your sprinklers.
Oh, yeah.
So what happens?
Right, so your lawn is beautiful and green and his is brown and dry, but he gets to enjoy the overspray. That's a good picture of what happens when you don't have good boundaries.
Yeah.
It's like you end up pouring your resources into other people, and they benefit without having to do any work.
Yeah.
And you get burned out and resentful.
Totally. And it's not just about them taking advantage. It's just that the dynamic it's not a good dynamic.
Right.
Like I'm the giver and you're the taker. And that's not how I think God intended relationships to be.
No.
And it can lead to all sorts of resentment, burnout, and even just feeling like we're being taken advantage of.
Absolutely. And we can even do this to ourselves, by the way.
Oh.
By like overcommitting, being a people pleaser, not taking care of our own needs. We violate our own boundaries all the time.
Yes. Oh my goodness, that's so true. Okay, so if boundaries are so important, why is it so hard for us to set them? Like why the struggle?
The book, it really dives into this whole psychological, emotional thing that we go through,
Yeah.
when it comes to boundaries. And one of the biggest obstacles is fear.
Fear.
Fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of disappointing people.
Oh, yeah.
And it makes sense, if we grew up in a home where boundaries were seen as disrespectful or rebellious. But we have to remember, healthy boundaries are not about controlling people.
Yeah.
They're about creating space for healthy, mutually respectful relationships.
Yes, and I think that's where we get confused sometimes. We think, oh, if I set a boundary, it means I don't love this person. Or if I set a boundary, it means I don't want to be in this relationship.
Right.
And it's really not that at all. One of the key takeaways I think that was so good in this book is the idea of recognizing the difference between being responsible to others versus being responsible for them.
That's a game changer right there.
Isn't that huge?
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of us, especially, in our faith background, we think we're responsible for people's happiness, for their choices, for their consequences. And that's just not true.
We are called to love our neighbor, but we are not responsible for their happiness, their choices, or the consequences of their choices.
Yes.
It's a huge distinction.
It is. Because I can love you and want the best for you, but I can't live your life for you.
Exactly. And that's where boundaries come in.
Yeah.
Help us define where our responsibility ends and where the other person's begins.
Yeah, that's so good. It's about finding that balance.
Right.
Like, I can care for you, but I also have to take care of myself.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now that we've kind of laid that groundwork, the book also talks about some common myths about boundaries.
And I think this is where it starts to get really practical.
Yeah.
Like, what are those lies that we tell ourselves? What are those things that keep us from setting healthy boundaries? So one of the biggest myths that they debunk is that boundaries are selfish.
Oh, yeah, that one's a big one.
Isn't it?
Especially in, cultures where selflessness and sacrifice are, super emphasized.
Totally.
But setting boundaries is actually an act of self-care and self-respect, like we were saying earlier.
Yes. It's recognizing that I have value.
Yep.
My time has value. My energy has value. My emotional well-being has value. And it's okay for me to protect that.
And when you take care of yourself, you can actually take better care of others.
Yes. You cannot pour from an empty cup, people.
That's true.
All right, so that's myth number one. Myth number two that they debunk: boundaries are a sign of disobedience.
Oh, especially in a spiritual context, right?
Oh, yes.
Like if you were raised in an environment where obedience was everything,
Yeah.
setting boundaries can feel really wrong. Totally. It's like, well, I'm supposed to obey, I'm supposed to submit, and all of those things. But the book actually says that sometimes saying no can be an act of obedience.
Right.
It can be obedience to our values, to our own limits, to even God's guidance in our lives, if you want to take it to that level.
Yeah, it's about discerning what's truly important and aligning your choices with your deepest convictions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes we have to say no to good things to say yes to the best things.
That's good.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's hard because we feel like we should be able to do it all. We should be able to be super mom, super dad, super employee, super volunteer, super friend, super, super, super.
Yeah.
And the reality is we're not.
You can't.
You can't. And so we have to make those choices. Okay, so another myth, and I think this is one that a lot of us probably wrestle with, is that if I set a boundary, people are going to get mad.
Oh, yeah.
Right? It's going to lead to conflict. It's going to lead to anger.
Yeah.
And so the book kind of addresses that head on and says, well, yeah, sometimes people might get mad. Yeah.
But you can't control their reactions.
Right. And it's important to approach boundaries with sensitivity and compassion. But ultimately, how other people respond is not your responsibility.
That's good.
You can control how you communicate your boundaries, and you can control how you manage your own emotions, but you can't control other people.
So it's about finding that balance. Like, I can be assertive, but I can also be empathetic.
Exactly. Being clear and firm, but also acknowledging the other person's feelings. It's not easy, but it's worth it.
So good. Okay, so now that we've kind of debunked those myths, I'm curious, how do these boundary principles play out in different types of relationships? Because I'm guessing a boundary with my spouse looks different than a boundary with my kids.
Totally different.
Right.
Yeah. Boundaries are dynamic. They shift depending on who you're interacting with. So let's start with marriage, because that's where things can get really, really tricky, especially since, the goal is to become one flesh, as the Bible says.
Yeah.
Right. And that's where those boundaries are even more crucial, I think, because you don't want that oneness to come at the expense of your own individuality.
Right, exactly. The book really emphasizes the importance of individuality within oneness. Like, each partner needs to maintain a sense of self while also nurturing the connection.
So it's not like we just merge into this blob.
No.
Right.
No.
We are two distinct people, but we are coming together to create this shared life.
That's it. And each person needs to feel free to express their thoughts, their feelings, their needs without being judged or shut down.
Yes.
And that requires boundaries.
That requires boundaries. Okay, so the book talks about setting boundaries around your time, your energy, even your emotional availability. which I think is a big one.
Yeah.
Like, how emotionally available am I to my spouse?
Right, because we have a limited capacity to give. And it's okay to say no to things that are beyond our limit.
Yes.
We're not superhuman.
And it's about respecting each other's yes, too. Like, if my husband is like, hey, I want to go, do this hobby, even if it's not something I'm into.
Yeah.
I need to respect that and be like, okay, I'm going to give you the space to do that.
You get to have your thing, and I get to have mine.
Yes, exactly. And this is where I think those 10 laws of boundaries come in. Like, remember the law of responsibility? We talked about that earlier. Like, we're responsible to love and support our spouse, but we're not responsible for their happiness.
Exactly.
Like, that's on them.
We can't live their lives for them.
No.
And if you try, it backfires every time.
Totally. So the book also, I think, does a really good job of kind of diving into this whole concept of submission in marriage, which I think a lot of us, it's a trigger word, right?
Okay. It's misunderstood. It's misused.
Totally. And I think the book does a really good job of saying, like, hey, let's define what biblical submission actually is, because a lot of times it's been used to control, manipulate, and all of those things.
Absolutely. And that's not what it's about at all.
And so they're saying, like, true biblical submission is about mutual respect.
Yeah.
It's about honoring each other's roles within the marriage.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about one person dominating the other.
Nope. It's partnership. It's collaboration.
Yeah.
And it's about, grace and freedom.
Yeah.
Like a husband demanding submission without giving grace and unconditional love.
Yes.
That's not Christ-like at all.
No.
It's about creating that safe, loving environment where both partners feel respected and empowered to be their authentic selves.
And I love that. So much of this is about safety. Like, do I feel safe to be myself? Do I feel safe to express my needs? Do I feel safe to say no?
Mm-hmm.
And I think in a good marriage with good boundaries, the answer should be yes.
Absolutely.
Then there's this issue of, like, how much togetherness is healthy versus how much separateness is healthy.
Oh, yeah. Too much of either is a problem.
Totally, because some couples are like, we got to do everything together. Other couples are like, we basically live separate lives.
Yeah.
Neither of those are good. So how do we find that balance?
The book uses this analogy of like a scale with 100 points of togetherness on one side and 100 points of separateness on the other.
Okay.
And in a healthy marriage, both partners are kind of contributing equally to each side.
So I'm not like fully enmeshed, but I'm not completely isolated either.
Right, exactly. It's finding that sweet spot where you both feel connected and supported, but you also have your own space to grow as individuals.
Yes, and I think that's where those boundaries come in.
Absolutely. They help you define your individual space and protect your time and energy.
Oh, that's so good. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about parenting, because I'm guessing it's a whole nother ballgame.
A whole nother ballgame.
Right. Like, how do we apply these boundary principles with kids who are still developing?
It's all about balance, providing structure and guidance, but also giving them the freedom to explore, make mistakes, and develop their own boundaries.
Because if they don't learn it now, they're not going to know how to do it as adults.
Exactly.
Right.
And one of the things the book emphasizes is the difference between discipline and punishment. Punishment is about paying for wrongdoing, while discipline is about teaching responsibility and helping kids learn from their choices.
Mm-hmm.
Good discipline moves the child towards more internal structure and self-control. It's not just about controlling them with external rules. It's about teaching them to regulate themselves.
That's good. It's like, I'm giving you the tools to eventually self-govern,
Right.
Okay. And then they have this great analogy in the book about a fence.
Oh, yeah.
Right. I love that.
So imagine, like, you have a little kid, you put up a fence in your backyard.
To keep them safe.
To keep them safe from wandering into the street, getting into the pool, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And they're saying boundaries are like that fence for a kid's soul. They protect them and help them navigate life.
And the fence has gates, right?
Right.
The fence is not like a prison. The fence has gates to let people in, let people out.
It allows for connection, intimacy, but it still sets limits.
Yes.
On harmful behavior.
So good. Okay, so how do we actually teach kids to respect those boundaries? Because that's a whole nother...
Oh, man, that's the million-dollar question.
Right. Like, how do I teach my 3-year-old to be like, oh, mommy has a boundary. I need to respect that.
Right. Well, it starts with us as parents. We have to model healthy boundaries in our own lives. Mm-hmm. How we handle our time, our emotions, our interactions with others They're watching us.
Kids are little sponges. They see everything.
Everything.
Yeah. So we have to model that, and we have to be consistent.
Oh, consistency is key.
Yeah.
They need to know the rules are firm, they're predictable, they're not changing on a whim.
And sometimes we have to let them experience the natural consequences of their choices.
Yes. Let them learn those lessons. Like, if they don't do their homework, they might get a bad grade. If they don't clean their room, they can't find their favorite toy.
Yes, natural consequences are the best teacher.
They are.
Because they can connect the dots, right? Like, oh, I made this choice.
Right.
This was the result. Maybe I should make a different choice next time.
Exactly. And speaking of choices, the book highlights how important it is to teach delayed gratification.
Oh, yeah.
Which is basically saying no to an immediate pleasure so you can get something better later on.
And this is a skill, even as adults, we struggle with this, right?
Big time.
You know, like instant gratification. I want it now. I want it now. I want it now. Versus, okay, I'm going to have some self-control.
Patience, yeah. Like saving for a special toy instead of spending your allowance all at once.
Yes. So how, I guess like practically, how do we teach kids about delayed gratification?
You know, the book talks about starting really young, even with babies.
Yeah.
Establishing those secure attachments. That sense of safety and connection lays the foundation for healthy boundary development later.
Oh, that's interesting. So even just being there for my baby when they cry and meeting their needs.
Yes, that's laying the groundwork for them to be able to trust you and themselves later on.
Oh, that's so cool.
Then you have the toddler years where it's all about exploration and boundary pushing.
Oh, yeah. They are pushing every boundary.
They're testing, they're learning. So that's where those consistent limits and natural consequences are so important.
Yes.
And then you get to the teenage years.
Oh, boy.
Oh, yeah. Where they need more freedom and responsibility. It's about slowly loosening the reins, letting them make more decisions on their own while still being there to guide them.
And the book really talks about the importance of that connection.
Yes.
Even when they're teenagers, like, don't fully check out, stay involved, stay connected.
Open communication, empathy,
Yeah.
a willingness to listen. That's huge.
So good. So it sounds like setting boundaries with kids it's an ongoing process.
Always.
There's no like, okay, I did this boundary workshop, now I'm done, they're good.
Right. It's a lifelong journey for both the parent and the child.
Totally.
And it lays the groundwork for the relationships throughout their lives.
That's good. Okay, let's shift gears one more time because we got to talk about boundaries at work.
Oh, yeah. In today's world, it's so easy for work to just bleed into everything.
And there's no separation, you know, and we're expected to be on all the time, answer emails, take calls. And so if we don't have good boundaries in the workplace, I think we're headed for disaster.
Burnout city.
Yeah. Burnout city. So what do healthy boundaries look like at work?
The book outlines some common issues that we face at work. Taking on too much, struggling to say no, letting work stress take over our personal lives.
Yeah.
But it all boils down to protecting your time, your energy, your mental health. You have a right to do that, even in a professional setting.
And I think it's hard because for a lot of us, our work is tied to our identity.
Yeah.
And so if I say no at work, I feel like, well, what does that say about me?
Right.
You know, am I not a hard worker? All those things. So where do we start?
Start with understanding your job description. Like, what are you actually responsible for? What are your priorities? And the book suggests making a list of your tasks and ranking them.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. So you can clearly communicate what you can handle and set realistic expectations.
That's so good. And be okay with saying no to overtime.
Yes. You have a life outside of work, and it deserves your time and attention too.
Yeah.
And when you set those boundaries, you're modeling healthy behavior for your colleagues, and you're creating a better work environment for everyone.
Yeah.
It's not just about you.
It's not just about me. And I think the book also does a good job of like talking about how do you deal with like difficult bosses or coworkers.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's a reality, right? Like
Right.
not everybody is going to be, you know, sunshine and roses.
Right.
So what do we do when we have those situations?
Well, it's easy to just avoid conflict or try to people pleasers. But the book really encourages us to be assertive and communicate our needs clearly, even if it feels awkward.
So good. Like being able to say like, hey, this is not okay.
Yep.
This is not how I want to be treated.
And remember, you're not responsible for other people's emotions. If someone freaks out because you set a boundary, that's on them.
That's on them. That's good.
On you.
Okay, so good. Anything else about boundaries at work before we kind of wrap up this section?
Yeah, I think the last thing is to remember that work can't fulfill every need. You know, like don't expect it to be your source of emotional intimacy, validation, a sense of belonging, all that.
Yes. Like work can be a part of that, but it shouldn't be everything.
Right. Cultivate those things in your personal life,
Yeah.
Have those healthy relationships. Take care of yourself. Don't rely on your job to meet every need.
Oh, that's so good. So good. So that's kind of our overview of boundaries in different relationships.
So-
What about boundaries with ourselves?
That's where it gets really interesting. Because it's easy to set boundaries with other people, but what about when we're the ones doing the thing we need a boundary from?
Right. It's like, okay, so you're overeating, you're overspending, you're overcommitting.
Exactly. And setting boundaries with ourselves is tough.
It is. But it's also, I think, one of the most freeing things we can do.
It is. It's about recognizing your limits, your needs, making choices that align with your values. It's like treating yourself with the same kindness and respect you would give to somebody you love.
Yes. So what are some of the areas, I guess, like practically speaking, where we might need to set boundaries with ourselves?
The book talks about eating habits, finances, time management, our relationship with technology, all that.
Okay, so let's start with eating.
Okay, good one. Because a lot of us struggle with self-control and emotional eating.
Yeah. It's so easy to just mindlessly snack or overeat when we're stressed or bored.
It's a coping mechanism. So the book encourages us to be more mindful, pay attention to our hunger signals, and make intentional choices about what we eat and why. Are we actually hungry? Or are we trying to numb something out?
That's so good. It's about having that healthy relationship with food.
Yeah, about nourishment and self-care, not guilt and deprivation.
So how do we practically set a boundary with myself when it comes to eating? What does that look like?
It's about those mindful choices like planning your meals, having healthy snacks on hand, listening to your body.
Okay, so good. What about finances? I think this is a big one.
Oh, yeah. Impulse spending, overspending, or even financial dependence.
Yes, and I think a lot of us, we have shame around money. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to look at our bank accounts.
Right. But the book says, you got to create a budget, track your spending, set realistic goals. It's about taking control of your money, making decisions that support your well-being.
Yeah.
It's empowering. Money's a tool for freedom and security. It shouldn't be a source of stress.
So good. And I think a lot of times, we're so used to living in that scarcity mindset with money.
Yeah.
I don't have enough. I don't have enough. I don't have enough. That we don't even think about, what if I did have enough?
Right.
How could I use money to create the life that I want?
Yeah. It's a mindset shift for sure.
Okay. So we've talked about eating, we've talked about finances. Another one, time management. I think this is huge, especially in, our culture where everything is so busy. Everybody's so busy.
Yeah.
It's like the badge of honor. Be like, I'm so busy.
Right.
And it's like, okay, but how are you managing your time?
The book says, set those clear priorities, schedule time for the important things,
Okay.
learn to say no.
Yes.
To commitments that drain you or aren't aligned with your values. You have a limited amount of time and energy. Spend it wisely.
So good. So good. All right. One more that I think we got to touch on in terms of boundaries with ourselves.
Yeah.
Technology.
Well, this is a new one.
Isn't it?
For a lot of people, it's a real struggle.
Yeah.
But the book says, be mindful. Set limits on your screen time. Create tech-free zones in your life. Technology is a tool. Don't let it control you.
Yes. It should be serving us, not the other way around.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. So this is all great, but I'm that person who's like, okay, but how do I apply this? Practically, where do I start? What are some actual steps?
Okay. So awareness is the first thing.
Okay.
You got to be more conscious of your patterns, your triggers, those moments when you feel your boundaries are being crossed.
So kind of paying attention to what's going on inside of me.
Yeah.
Do I feel resentment? Do I feel stressed? Do I feel, angry?
Right. Those are signs that your boundaries are probably being stepped on.
Oh, that's good. Our bodies are really good at giving us signals. It's just we're not always listening.
We ignore them.
Okay, so that's step one. Awareness.
Yep.
Step two.
Once you know your patterns, you can start figuring out what your boundaries need to look like.
Okay.
What needs to be protected? What are your non-negotiables? What are you willing to tolerate? And what are you absolutely not willing to put up with?
So it's about getting clear on what's more values and what's important to me.
Right. So you can make choices that are in line with who you are and what you want.
Yeah.
And then you can start communicating those boundaries.
Okay. So that's where it gets tricky.
It can be tough, but it's about having those conversations, setting limits, maybe even creating some distance.
Okay. So give us some more practical tips on how to actually set those boundaries.
One of the most helpful things in the book, I think, is the idea of visualizing your boundaries.
Okay.
Imagine them as a protective shield around you, keeping the good stuff in, keeping the bad stuff out.
Oh, I love that because it
that-
makes it less abstract. Like I can actually picture that.
Right, exactly. And as you picture it, ask yourself, what needs to be protected here? What are my non-negotiables? What are my deal breakers?
Okay, so that makes sense. And I think this goes back to what you said earlier about recognizing our limits. So practically, how do I know where my limit is?
Well, pay attention to your body. Like, how are you feeling? Overwhelmed, resentful, exhausted. Those are usually signs that a boundary is being crossed.
So it's like my body's trying to tell me something.
It is.
It's just I'm not listening.
Exactly. We ignore those signals, but we need to learn to tune in and honor what our body's telling us.
Okay, so pay attention to those body signals.
Yeah.
What else?
Think about past experiences. Like, when have you felt taken advantage of? When have you said yes when you really wanted to say no? What happened as a result?
Okay, so looking for patterns.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Once you see those patterns, you can start anticipating situations and be more prepared to respond in a way that protects you.
So I'm not caught off guard.
Right.
I'm not like in the heat of the moment making a decision that I'm going to regret later. Okay, so we've identified our boundaries, or at least we're starting to. We're paying attention to our bodies. We're looking for those patterns. Now we actually got to communicate those boundaries.
Right. And that's where a lot of people get stuck.
Totally. Because it can be scary.
It can. You're afraid of hurting feelings, starting a fight.
Yeah.
But honestly, the book says clear communication is the most loving thing you can do.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. Because it prevents misunderstandings and resentment down the road.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we communicate our boundaries assertively but respectfully?
Use I statements.
Okay.
Talk about your own feelings, your own experiences.
So not you always do this,
Right. Not blaming.
but I feel this way when this happens.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to be direct about what you need. I need some time alone tonight. I can't take on any more projects right now.
Okay, so be clear, be direct, use I statements. Got it. But what happens when people push back?
Oh, yeah, they will. They'll get angry, try to guilt trip you, all that. But remember, you can't control how they react. Okay. You can only control your response.
So if someone's pushing back, what do I do?
Stay calm. Reiterate your limit.
Okay, so just hold that boundary.
Yeah. Don't give in. And if they keep being disrespectful or dismissive, you might have to create some distance.
So limiting contact, ending a conversation, walking away.
Sometimes, yeah, it's the healthiest thing you can do.
Okay, so that's setting boundaries with like the average person.
Mm-hmm.
What about when someone's behavior is harmful or unhealthy, like an addiction or abuse?
Right. Those are tougher situations.
Yeah.
But the same principle applies. You can't control their choices, but you can protect yourself.
So even if it's someone I love, like my responsibility is to my own well-being first.
Yes.
Okay.
You have to prioritize your safety and your sanity.
And sometimes that means walking away.
Sometimes, yeah, it's the toughest choice, but sometimes it's the best one.
And again, the book talks about getting support in those situations.
Yes. Don't try to do it alone. Talk to a therapist. Find a support group. Lean on a trusted friend.
Get those people around you who can support you and encourage you.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about the resistance we might face from other people, but what about the resistance that comes from within ourselves? You know, those voices that say, you're not worthy, you're not capable.
Oh, yeah. That internal resistance is a sneaky one.
It is.
It's like having a little critic in your head just constantly undermining you.
Totally.
And one of the biggest fears that drives this is the fear of loss.
Loss of what?
Loss of love, loss of approval, loss of connection.
It's like, if I set a boundary, everyone's going to leave me.
Right. And that fear is understandable, especially if you've experienced rejection in the past.
Yeah.
But you got to ask yourself, is this a real connection? Or is it just codependency?
So, like, am I holding on to this relationship for the wrong reasons?
Right. Healthy relationships can handle boundaries. In fact, boundaries make them stronger.
Oh, that's good. So by setting a boundary, I'm actually helping the relationship.
You are, because you're creating clarity, honesty, respect.
Okay, so that's fear of loss. What other fears do we have?
Fear of conflict. A lot of us were raised to believe that conflict is bad.
Avoid it at all costs.
Yeah,
But the book says conflict is a natural part of any relationship.
it is. It's inevitable.
Mm.
But it doesn't have to be a bad thing.
So it's not about avoiding conflict altogether. It's about handling it well.
Exactly. Learn how to do it constructively. Communicate your needs assertively, but kindly. Recognize that you can disagree with someone and still love and respect them.
Okay. So we've got fear of loss, fear of conflict. What else?
Oh, the big one. Fear of disappointing others.
This is me.
This is a lot of it, especially if you're a people pleaser. You were taught your worth comes from what you do for others.
Oh, yeah. I gotta make everyone happy.
Right, and you're terrified of letting people down.
Totally. But the book says you can't make everyone happy.
You can't. And if you try, you're going to burn yourself out.
So it's okay to disappoint people sometimes.
It is. You have a right to make choices that are good for you, even if someone else doesn't like it. Their disappointment is not your responsibility.
Oh, that's hard.
It is,
Yeah.
but it's freeing.
Okay, so we've talked about fear of loss, fear of conflict, fear of disappointing others. One more, I think, that's kind of tied into all of this. The fear that setting a boundary is selfish.
Oh, yeah. We feel like we're being mean, uncaring, putting ourselves first.
Especially, like you said earlier, in cultures where selflessness is valued so highly.
Exactly.
But the book says setting a boundary is actually an act of self-respect.
It is. You're recognizing your worth.
Yeah.
You're taking care of yourself. And when you take care of yourself, you're actually better equipped to take care of others.
Yes.
Yeah.
That goes back to that whole empty cup thing, right?
Exactly. Fill your own cup first, then you can pour into others.
Okay, so we've identified some of these fears, these inner barriers that are keeping us from setting boundaries. How do we start to break them down? How do we overcome that internal resistance?
It's a process, but the first step is to acknowledge that you have a problem. Be honest with yourself about your boundary issues. Recognize those patterns that are holding you back.
So I can't just pretend it's not happening.
Nope. You got to face the truth, get real with yourself,
Yeah.
and it might feel uncomfortable, even a little embarrassing.
Yeah, no one likes to admit they have problems.
But it's the only way to change. And be kind to yourself through the process. It's not about beating yourself up for past mistakes. It's about learning and growing.
And remember what we said about support.
Oh, yes. Find a therapist, a support group, a trusted friend. Having someone to talk to process with, it makes a huge difference.
They can help us challenge those negative thoughts.
Yeah. They can remind us that we're not alone. They can help us stay accountable.
Okay, so acknowledge the problem, get support. What else?
The book talks about identifying the wish behind the fear. Like, what are you really longing for? What need are you trying to meet by being boundaryless?
Okay, so if I'm afraid of setting a boundary because I'm afraid of losing a relationship, the wish behind that fear is connection.
Right. So you can start looking for healthier ways to connect with people.
People who respect me, who value me.
Exactly. You deserve relationships that are built on mutual respect and trust. You don't have to earn love by constantly saying yes.
That's good. Okay, so identify the wish behind the fear. What else?
Don't underestimate the power of grieving.
Grieving.
Yeah, when you set a boundary, you might experience a sense of loss, like you're letting go of a relationship or an old way of being.
Okay. So it's okay to feel sad or disappointed.
Absolutely. Allow yourself to feel those feelings. Don't try to push them away.
So it's like I'm mourning what I thought the relationship was.
Yeah. And that's a healthy part of the process. It allows you to move on and create something new.
Okay, so grieve those losses.
And then shift your focus. Think about the positive aspects of setting boundaries.
Okay, so what am I gaining by setting this boundary?
Yeah. Freedom, peace, self-respect, healthier relationships, all that good stuff.
It's like instead of looking at what I'm losing, I'm looking at what I'm gaining.
Exactly. And you're gaining a lot.
Wow. I love that. I feel like this whole conversation about boundaries has been such a mind shift for me.
It is a mind shift, and it's a heart shift, too.
Totally. It's like I'm starting to see boundaries as a source of strength and freedom, not as something that's restricting me.
That's exactly it. Boundaries are not about closing yourself off. They're about creating space for healthier connections.
Like building a stronger foundation for my relationship.
Absolutely. A foundation based on respect, honesty, and a deep understanding of yourself and others.
So good. I feel like we've covered so much ground, but I'm excited to keep going.
Me too. In the next part, we're going to get even more practical. We'll talk about specific strategies for setting boundaries in all those different areas of life.
All right, deep divers, we are back, and we are in the final part of our deep dive into boundaries.
We are.
And so far, we've talked about why boundaries are important. We've talked about some of those resistances that we might face. But now I'm ready for, like, the rubber meets the road stuff.
Okay, let's do it.
Give me the practical tips. Like, how do I actually set these boundaries? Because it's one thing to talk about them, but it's another thing to actually do it.
You're right. It's time to empower you with some actionable steps.
Yes, actionable steps. I like it.
All right, so remember, setting boundaries is not about controlling other people. It's about taking ownership of your own life, your choices, your well-being.
Okay.
The first step is to get really clear on what those boundaries are for you. What are those areas where you constantly feel drained, resentful, taken advantage of?
Well, I'm paying attention to those red flags.
Exactly. Those moments when you feel your energy being zapped or like your values are being compromised.
Okay, and then?
Then ask yourself, what needs protecting here? What are my non-negotiables? Where do I need to draw the line in the sand?
Oh, I like that. It's like, this is it. This is where I stand firm.
Exactly. Once you have that clear understanding of your boundaries, you can start communicating them to others.
And that's where those assertive communication skills that we talked about come into play, right?
Got it. Remember, setting boundaries isn't about being aggressive or demanding. It's about communicating your needs and your limits clearly, calmly, and respectfully.
Okay, so remind me, what are some of those, like, practical communication tips?
Use I statements.
Okay.
Like, I feel disrespected when you're constantly late for our appointments.
So instead of saying you're always late, which is going to make the person defensive, I'm focusing on how it makes me feel.
Exactly. And be direct about what you need. Don't be afraid to say, I need some quiet time tonight, or I can't take on any more projects right now.
Okay, so be clear, be direct, use I statements. Got it. But what if the other person, like, totally resists my boundaries?
This happens.
What if they get angry? Or they try to guilt trip me? Or they just flat out refuse to respect my limits? What do I do then?
Remember, you can't control how other people react, but you can control your own response.
Okay.
So if someone's pushing back against your boundary, stay calm and just reiterate your limits.
Okay, so I'm holding from.
You're standing your ground. And if they continue to be disrespectful or dismissive, you might need to create some distance. That might mean limiting contact, ending the conversation, maybe even stepping away from a relationship if it's consistently violating your boundaries.
That's tough, but
Yeah.
sometimes I guess it's necessary.
Sometimes it's the healthiest and most loving thing you can do for both of you.
And again, the book talks about getting support, especially in those tough situations.
Absolutely. Don't try to go it alone. Talk to a therapist, find a support group, confide in a trusted friend.
Have those people in your corner who can encourage you, support you, hold you accountable.
Exactly. They'll remind you that you're not alone and that what you're doing is brave and important.
Wow, this has been so helpful.
I'm glad.
I feel like I have a much better understanding of what boundaries are, why they're important, and how to actually set them.
That's great to hear. And remember, it's a journey, not a destination.
Okay.
There will be challenges, there will be setbacks, but keep practicing, keep growing, and trust that as you honor your boundaries, you are creating a more beautiful and fulfilling life for yourself and for those you love.
That's so good. It's a reminder that setting boundaries is not selfish. It's an act of self-love and self-respect.
It is?
It's about taking care of ourselves so we can show up in our relationships as our best selves.
Absolutely.
And that's what it's all about, right?
It is, creating a life that's aligned with our values and our deepest desires. A life that's filled with joy, peace, and authentic connection. And it all starts with those boundaries.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into boundaries.
My pleasure.
If you're ready to go even deeper, we highly recommend checking out the full text of Boundaries, When to Say Yes, How to Say No to Take Control of Your Life.
It's a game changer. And don't forget to reach out for support. Find a trusted friend, a therapist, a support group. There's strength in community and wisdom in seeking guidance from others.
That's so true. Until next time, deep divers, keep diving deep and keep setting those boundaries.